Thank you very much for being here. So I have a habit when I give presentations of pacing around, and so there might be a chance that I'll leave the microphone and my voice might become a bit more distant, so if that happens, just feel free to call me out on it. So I'm here from Canada. I'm part of a company called Discrete Integration, where we do mainly information security, information exploitation. And what I'll be talking about this morning is Steganographic disencryption, which is a roughly equivalent in functionality to VeraCrypt's hidden partition function, which some of you may know about already. If not, that's no big deal. We'll make sure that we all get there before I get into the meat of the presentation. So some apologies in advance. I think I was overly ambitious with the material I'd hoped to cover this morning. So there's going to be some slides further down in the weeds that I'm just going to skip over. But by all means, I think feel free to contact me, get in touch with me. The slides, I think, should be available on Black Hat's website as of this evening. So feel free to peruse and get in touch with me if there's anything further you'd like to discuss. So without further ado, so I'll give you a brief, this is an outline of my presentation. I'll give you a brief overview of steganography, its history, its modern day importance. It's often, I would think, neglected to its larger cousin, cryptography. I'll give you a critical appraisal of TrueCrypt VeraCrypt's hidden OS feature, and I'll explain to you how, despite the fact that you have, I suppose, in a technical sense, plausible deniability, it falls short in many practical applications. And so at that point, we should all be up to speed. We should all have the lexicon and the concepts in place so that we can digest the rest of the talk. And so once we've analyzed VeraCrypt a little bit, I'll give you in broad terms the requirements a steganographic system should satisfy for it to be useful in practice. And so that in turn will translate into a number of technical requirements that we have to meet if you want to do something like VeraCrypt's hidden partition function in a more deniable fashion. And so what I'll show you when you do that, it basically partitions the problem into two orthogonal, two roughly independent parts. That'll cover the system design 1 and system design 2, and I'll conclude with a brief overview of some forensic considerations if you want to use this kind of system in practice. So this system is actually, there's a proof of concept, so just bear that in mind. Like all of the theory I'll explain to you has actually been tried out in practice. Okay, so what is steganography? So most of you probably know this already, also called steg, is literally covered writing. And so what it boils down to is taking an innocuous medium, which you call a cover. A cover is a technical term that I'll refer to again and again. And you embed some secret message in that cover. And the hope is that some adversary looks at this cover and they won't be able to detect the presence of that secret message in the cover. And so like cryptography, steganography dates back way before computers, basically since the beginning when civilization has records. And so like cryptography, basically steganography is now basically exclusively in the domain of digital techniques. And so I mean some basic examples of steg would be, for instance, was hiding an entire paragraph in a microdot by shrinking it down and then recovering it again with a microscope, or some more exotic or colorful examples listed here. So simply for the purpose of contrasting this against cryptography, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the framework of analyzing crypto systems. I'm sure most of you know this already, so it's a standard Alice, Bob, Eve setup here. So everybody here, the important thing here is everybody knows what everybody is doing. The game is like open to everybody. What Alice is trying to do with Bob is communicate in a fashion where the communication itself is not covert, but the message is. And Eve is trying to break that message. And so that's the opposing goal, and basically it's a game. And whoever's better at the game wins this game. So Alice and Bob, they have some scheme they're up to, and they came across a textbook from the 1970s, I think, documenting how triple DES is the latest and best cipher that should be used for everything. And unfortunately, nobody counseled them against using triple DES, and so they landed in jail because where they made their scheme was a hostile jurisdiction. So the goals here are now different. This is steganography. So you have a warden here who on compassionate grounds will forward messages between Alice and Bob, and the warden here will not forward anything that relates to, for example, staging a prison break, which is their new goal. And so Alice and Bob want to coordinate their efforts, but in a manner that doesn't alert the warden to what's going on. And that's basically the heart of steganography, which is you have the cover, which is innocuous, and you want to embed something in the cover, not tipping off the person who is going to be looking at that cover. And that's basically it. And so you replace the Eve with the warden, and the breaking of the cipher is replaced with detecting something. Not necessarily deciphering the hidden message, but detecting the presence of a hidden message. So what are some topical applications of steganography? So, in the free worlds, like in Canada, United States, the UK, we have a lot of, we have human rights basically enshrined in our respective constitutions. So we have like freedom against unreasonable search and seizure, probable cause, due process, proof beyond a reasonable doubt, things like that. And so in that kind of environment, beyond cryptography, you don't really need very much. But for the rest of the world, which is a pretty hostile place, or can be a pretty hostile place, you have to be able to disavow possession of certain information. And so just having something encrypted is not good enough. There's an XKCD cartoon, some guys you may know. There's the first frame is two stick figures lamenting the fact that they're not able to break, this AES 256. It would take eons. And then the next frame, there's a guy with a wrench from Home Depot that cost $5 and said, we're just going to beat him and drug him until he gives us the passphrase. And so that's basically, so if you look at cryptography, it's come a really long way. The theory is really good at this point. The implementation, if you look at Signal and other applications like that, are really good. And so what's the weakest link? It's the human, right? Because humans don't like being tortured generally. So where does, specifically, where does this come up? Protection of journalists and their sources. So a lot of countries don't have protections of the press, protections of NGO staff. For example, if you're, let's say, trying to exfiltrate some documentary evidence of human rights abuses, you can encrypt it, but when you go through a checkpoint, you'll be asked to surrender your passphrase, and it won't do you much good. There's economic considerations, so I'm not going to mention any countries by name, but let's say you go to certain places in the world where they're just going to image your hard drive and hoover up whatever IP they can. These places are also places where they're cracking down VPNs, so good luck trying to log into your company server to download the documents remotely through a VPN. Then there's undercover work. So if you're, for example, with an intelligence agency working abroad, you don't have diplomatic cover, or you're working domestically as a police force, where you want to infiltrate, for example, a gang, you might need to possess certain information that you want to be able to disavow. And so that's where steganography comes in. So encryption is adequate, and there's no risk of forced password disclosure. For everything else, use steganography. So very briefly, the classic example of steg is putting something into an image, replacing the least significant bit of every pixel with your message. You shouldn't do that. That's really insecure, as most of you probably know already. There's more sophisticated ways of doing it. 802.11 wireless steg is something that's interesting. It's emerging right now. So basically, that's where you have certain wireless frames. They contain putatively something that is random, but in fact, that can be ciphertext. And so if you have another person listening in promiscuous mode to the air, they can decrypt that random bit in the frame. Then you have things like VeraCrypt, StegFS. So that's where basically secret information is secreted into unused disk space. And then you have things like spread spectrum. But the important point here is that all of these require special hardware, special software. And so that's going to be a problem. Very briefly, some forensic analysis techniques. So if you use a cover file from Google, for example, Google Images, it's really bad because you do side-by-side comparisons. It's really trivial to find that that's been modified. You can do a direct forensic analysis. So let's say your game is a little bit better and you take a picture with your SLR and then you embed something using, for example, these open source tools like OpenSteg or whatever. Be really careful when you do that because there's a lot of statistics in there, like, of the CCD detector, of like the lens and so forth. And unless you really understand the statistics, you're probably going to break them in a fashion that's going to be detectable by your adversary. And the third one here I dub roughly like, side channel attack, where basically look for evidence that steg was used, like in swap space or something like that, but it's not a direct attack. So this is what I submit to you are the essential ingredients of steg, where I think existing steg falls short. So you need forensic resistance, which I just described a minute ago. It's fairly straightforward. Don't put stuff in swap, for instance. And then you need plausible deniability. And if you just recall, the places in the world you use steg are not the places where plausible deniability has to reach a high threshold. For example, where you have, guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, or whatever the metric might be. Those are places where if the index of suspicion against you moves even a little bit, that's grounds in which they'll do awful things to you. And so we have to be, I think, very diligent in the way we, conceive of plausible deniability. Plausible deniability means really the index of suspicion does not move against you even a little bit. Once you have those two ingredients in place, I'll submit to you that that gives you a fairly good steg system. Okay. So just a brief background. So as I mentioned, the functionality that I hope to develop is roughly equivalent to VeraCrypt's hidden partition function. So VeraCrypt has its origins in TrueCrypt, which in turn has its origins in encryption for the masses. And this guy here to the left, sorry, I'm not very adept at using this apparently, is Paul LaRue. He's a very interesting guy from South Africa. Gifted programmer, but also a bit of a career criminal, crime overload. If you have like 4 hours to burn, there's, I think, a really interesting bio on him on Medium or like Long Reads or something. So just to get now very briefly talk about vanilla disencryption, because that's sort of the starting point for everything else. So here we have a system. On the right, you have just a standard hard drive. You have an encryption layer, and then you have a block device that's given to the OS. And so there's basically a sector-to-sector mapping between this block device here and this block device here, up to maybe a linear shift that accounts for some headers on the disk itself. And so basically when the operating system or the file system writes something, it goes through the encryption layer, gets encrypted that sector, and then gets written out to the right-hand side. And the process happens in reverse as well. That's the basis. So so that's when you get standard disk encryption. And so you look at the header here, for example, Luke's, or the TrueCrypt is going to have whatever headers. So everybody's going to be aware, and you can strip out the headers if you want, but generally you're going to be aware, your adversary is going to be aware that you're using encryption. So VeraCrypt offers this additional functionality. It's called the hidden partition functionality. And so what you do is you need 2 partitions. And the first partition is just ordinary vanilla disk encryption. The second partition is sort of the same, except you have a lot of slack space here. That's dead space between the file system, as given by this question mark here. And so typically before you install disencryption, the first thing you do is overwrite everything with random data. And so that random data will still exist there. Residual random data from your initialization between the slack space. And so that can be random data, or it can be ciphertext to something secret. And that's where VeraCrypt derives its plausible deniability from, is the ambiguity of this question mark here. So if it's ciphertext to something else, then you can apply a encryption decryption layer to it, and you have another block device here, your secret system, right? And you can put an entire operating system on top of that. So, the details might be a little bit off, but that's the general gist of how it works. Forensic security is really high. They had a couple of issues a while back I think they fixed up. But the question is it a plausible deniability? So you have, number 1, 2 partitions configured in this way. You have trim that you have to disable because your slack space otherwise is gone. You need to freeze this file system here of the second partition, otherwise you risk overwriting the yellow question mark data. And so you put all those things together on top of having VeraCrypt. Is it plausible? And so I think it's probably plausible in a legal sense, like in a free country. Is it plausible where the index of suspicion has to move against you just a little bit? Probably not. And so I don't want to disparage VeraCrypt at all. It's really good software, but they offer on their website a remedy for this, or at least superficially, which is if you're asked about this, your adversary is going to ask you, why do you have all these peculiar things on your computer? And you'll say, okay, well here's a reason. But it's a bit of a It's really unfortunate because you'll be detained somewhere, sit down, and you'll give this reason, you'll offer this reason up, and then they'll look at this page, and they'll sort of have a chuckle and say, yeah, okay, great. So what are the 2 ingredients we absolutely need for steganographic disencryption? So if we want to replicate that functionality of VeraCrypt, what do we want to do? So forensic security, that's fairly straightforward. I think that's fairly clear at this point. Deniability. So the cover system, for example, in Ubuntu should appear completely normal. There should be no incriminating software visible whatsoever. So it should appear bit for bit as if it were installed with default settings. The asterisk here is because encryption I don't think is default, but it might as well be. You'd be remiss if you didn't use disk crypto for everything nowadays, I think. Okay, so what does that translate into practice? So it's a fairly tall order. We want a system that looks completely normal from the outside. Well, we still have slack space we can play with. So disregarding the issue with trim, I'll get back to that at the end of the presentation, but let's say you have slack space. So the slack space, you can write something to it in an encrypted form. It takes on a random sort of appearance. And okay, great. So what's the problem with that? Well, you have a cover system now. So you're embedding stuff in between the files of your cover system. The slack space, the cover system, as you keep using it, it will overwrite the slack space, and you're going to have data loss. The silver lining here is that most of your data is going to remain intact. So if you have like a 2 terabyte drive and you use your cover system like in a normal fashion, you're going to have a lot of slack space that's never going to be overwritten, or at least not for a long time. So it basically begs a solution, which is error correction. So forward error correction, that is. So basically you start off with a bit of data on the left. In this case, I've instantiated the problem with something like a file. It can be a file system, it can be an OS or whatever. And you add some redundancy to it, and then you distribute it across the slack space. You let your cover system run, destroy data left, right, and center. And at a later point, you look at those original sectors where you embedded your data, and you extract, and you do error correction, and you recover your initial data. Okay, great. There's one more thing we have to do. We have to make absolutely certain that if we're doing this, we never overwrite anything touched by the cover system. Not now, not before. And the issue is not only not corrupting the cover system, but also making sure that the deleted files remain intact, because that's really important for the forensic picture data. If you can do those two things, then here's basically, you're on a good path. And so here basically you have problem, solution, problem, solution. The solution at the end of the day, half of the solution to this problem, is a kernel module. The kernel module does all of this error correction. It does all the, making sure it doesn't overwrite any cover system stuff. It does everything automatically. And what it does is it presents to the user a really nice, easy to use block device. So you just write to that block device. That's basically it. And you can put a file system. You can put an OS on top of that. That's half the problem. Now you have this really incriminating kernel module. And so what do? You can download it. You can possess it with you. Those are really not ideal solutions in really hostile environments. What if you can get the kernel module to hide itself? And it sounds like voodoo, but actually I'll show it to you that it's quite possible, and hopefully by the end I'll have persuaded you that in fact it's quite possible indeed. So here's a bird's eye view of a running system. So only one of these systems runs at once. The top one is a very standard cover system. It's a very standard system with disk encryption. It has to look exactly like a normal system. If it doesn't, that's going to give your adversary some reason to question you. And the bottom system is your hidden system. And the difference there is you actually have a layer here, the steg layer here, which does all of the error correction, does all of the protection of the cover system data and so forth. So if information comes in from the left, it goes through the file system here, it gets written to this block device, and all this error correction and redundification and diffusion is done, and the reverse process happens as well. All the while leaving the green sectors, which are the bits of the cover system, completely intact. Okay, so this is the part I have to skip over. It's interesting, so by all means, come talk to me after and I can give you more technical details about how this works. The basic idea is we have the error correction is implemented using coding blocks. And so typically what you do is you install the hidden system first, and then on top of that, once you have basically what looks like random noise, you install your cover system. And so you're going to have on your disk a sequence of coding blocks. And each coding block is independent in so much that it uses information from the block itself to do the error correction. So here you have, for example, what's in yellow is your data, and what's in blue is your redundancy, to simplify the picture a little bit. And so if there's some corruption here, the blue stuff and the yellow stuff come together, and you use your error correction code, and you actually recover the original data. And so basically what you do is if you install the hidden system, the first thing you do is establish the cryptographic mapping under the hidden key. And so maybe I should have actually been a bit more clear here. These de-encrypt layers here are with respect to different keys. You have your cover key here, which corresponds to the passphrase that you divulge to anybody who interrogates you. And down here you have your hidden key. And so this reinterprets the underlying device from different cryptographic perspectives with respect to different keys. So, okay. So now you have, when you install your hidden system, you first of all establish that crypto mapping with respect to the hidden key. You add a whole bunch of blocks, coding blocks initialized to 0 or whatever the initialization value is, great. But the coding blocks are one after the other on the disk. And so if, let's say, you have the cover system come by and overwrites an entire coding block, which is, let's say, on the order of 10 megabytes, quite conceivable, there's no way of recovering from that error if it's completely overwritten. So the way you get around that is basically randomize how the coding blocks are distributed on the disk. So instead of having them sequentially one after the other in a spatial arrangement that's very neat, you have a random arrangement. So the individual sectors that comprise a given coding block are distributed randomly across the disk. And so you can show what that is equivalent to, because the randomization process is statistically independent from, let's say, ext4 or riser of s or whatever's running on top on the cover system. Because it's independent, that's equivalent to randomizing the error. So each coding block is going to, up to like a statistical sort of fuzziness, going to experience the same amount of overwrites. And as a consequence, there's a couple of consequences. It means you can do the error correction really well. It means you can model the system really well. It means the system models perfectly as a binary erasure channel, which means you know the right error correction to use, which in this case is low density parity check, which means you have really, really strong theoretical guarantees that you're going to be able to recover all of your data. And so that's basically the kernel module. And so how do you get, one of the problems with randomization, especially when you're using, for example, a magnetic drive, is that you're going to have a lot of random accesses on your underlying device, which will kill your performance. So there's a number of remedies for that. One of the big ones is having a really, really large cache, And I found in practice it works really well. So most of the operations done are cached, and eventually there's a synchronization to the disk when there's some idle time. And the other remedy is to so if you have, let's say, a number of coding blocks and they all have, let's say you're loading a bunch, you're saving a bunch to disk, you have all these operations that are spread out randomly across the disk, you interleave them. So you have something that looks like an elevator scheduler that you guys might be familiar with in Linux. And so the consequence there is that you can ameliorate to a significant extent like the randomization that would kill performance otherwise. So here's a really high-level architecture of the kernel module. I'm not going to go into too much detail. This is actually a simplification. So it was written in C++, despite the fact that it's in kernel space for Linux, which is not a lot of fun, but it's fairly complex. So it was actually easier to do it than writing in plain C. So basically, you have from the left, you have, for example, a request that comes in from the hidden OS. It goes through the file system. It makes its way to the kernel module here, which means it comes in from the left here. And if it can be serviced right away with what's in memory here, the coding blocks, great. Then the request is turned around, the buyer request is turned around really quickly, and it goes out where it came from. On the other hand, if it needs some data that hasn't yet been decoded or hasn't yet been read from disk, then it gets sent to this purgatory here, the pending blocks. And at some point, when there's a slot free in the cache, it's going to be read from disk, decoded, and then sent back out again. Roughly the same for reads and writes. I mean, back and like decoding, encoding, make the right substitutions. So there's a lot of multi-threaded stuff happening here, and the reason is that like the encoding and decoding, the error correction, hashing, and so forth that I'll describe momentarily is really, you can make things a lot faster by having things run in parallel. And also for the I/O. So if you're using, for example, an NVMe drive that really favors parallelism, you might want the opposite of having like an elevator scheduler. You want a lot of like parallel reads and writes. Okay, so I'm going to skip over this here, but by all means, again, if you guys want to talk about this, I'd be happy to. So LDPC, load and parity check, this error correcting code, the implementation. So what I mentioned before is that sectors that are overwritten by the cover system are sacrosanct. They cannot be touched by the hidden system when it's writing data to the slack space. And so the way it's done is by simply taking each sector and allocating 32 bytes to a hash. And so if we just conceive of what happens, the cover system comes along under the cover system key, it writes something to the sector, and so what that translates into on the underlying block device is something that looks sort of random. With respect to the hidden system, when that's decrypted with respect to the hidden system key, again, it looks random. And so you have that random, something that looks sort of random, the hash and data are not going to match. And so that's how you detect overwrites by the cover system. And then there's some design decisions here, which is when you do error correction, you decide how much redundancy to add. And basically it tells you how robust the error correction code is going to be against overwrites. And so in this case here, I chose something that's roughly 50-50. So that is to say, you can overwrite about 50% of the drive from the cover system without actually having any loss of data whatsoever from the hidden system. Conversely, the hidden system caps out at about 50%. It's an arbitrary distribution or allocation, and you can change it fairly easily. So implementation of the cache, it was a bit of a nightmare, and there was I think one instance where I was like on all fours on the living room floor with a whole bunch of printouts of source code, like a crazy guy out of a movie looking for patterns in something. And but eventually I was able to get everything debugged. So the problem is not only is it not pleasant to write stuff in kernel space, it's for the kernel that is, it's also not pleasant to write really multi-threaded things and really asynchronous state machines and so forth. But I guess the bottom line here is that you have all these requirements, high-level requirements that steganography demands that you satisfy for deniability, and you satisfy one, but then you generate new requirements, like derivative requirements, until the last thing you can do, the only thing you have any control over, is just eating the complexity that you're left with. So you have a really complex system that does all the caching, it does all the the scheduling and so forth, and that's really sort of an unavoidable consequence of satisfying those high-level steganography requirements. Okay, so you're going to say, okay, this is all great theoretically. How does this translate to in practice? What does this translate to in practice? And I'm really happy to say it runs really fast. So if you have anything you need to do in the field, the software is not the fastest. I mean, if you guys remember, Windows 95 was sort of clunky, especially if you needed a defrag, but it got the job done. If you have a really fast machine with NVMe, for example, it runs blazingly fast. It's actually going to be running faster than a normal system, like that runs spinning Rust. So the bottom line is, not only does this work in theory, but it works perfectly well in practice. Okay, so that was the first half. Remember I said there's two basic components. The first component was the kernel module that does all of the steg itself. Now the kernel module has to hide itself. Okay, so here's a bit of a fantasy. What if you have a running system? If you have a running system, you can just secrete the kernel module away alongside everything else you want to hide. But now it's chicken and egg. You have a catch-22. How do you extract the kernel module if you need the kernel module in the first place? And so that doesn't work. So let's back up for a second. We don't have this nice, neat block device that we can just read and write stuff from. What if we work directly with the slack space? Now the problem with slack space is the constant jeopardy of being overwritten by the cover system. And so, pardon me, what can we do? Well, the kernel module, for a few reasons, because the coding, the coefficients for the code consume a lot of space. There's a lot of complexity in the code itself. Let's say it's on the order of a megabyte. So what you have to hope is that you're going to be able to find a region of slack space that is not a contiguous region of 1 megabyte that is not overwritten. Okay, maybe you'll have luck doing that, maybe not. Maybe you can store a whole bunch of copies, right, repeatedly, and just keep running them, insmod, putting them into the kernel and keeping your fingers crossed. Now, you probably wouldn't do that. You'd probably use a checksum or something to be a bit more sophisticated, but it's not a very satisfying solution. What can you do? If you roll up your sleeves, do a bit of assembly language programming, and write something that's 1 kilobyte, you can actually do a lot. And so with 1 kilobyte, you can actually, if you have, let's say that's 2 sectors, just to back up a little bit, you're probably going to have a lot of single sector or 2 sector contiguous regions free, lots and lots. That's basic laws of probability. Okay, so you have 2 sectors now. You can do a lot with 2 sectors in assembly language. You can scan through the entire disk, recover a whole bunch of corrupted data, do error correction on that data, put it together into a new executable, and run that executable that's much larger. You have a much larger executable now. It can do the same thing. You repeat, rinse, repeat, until you have a huge executable, whatever you want, an entire running system, right? And so basically you just do this iteratively. And so the way the boot system works is like this, basically. So you have your cover system. Let's say you stock Ubuntu machine is going to be using grub. You tell grub break, so you break into early user space. From early user space, you copy over a couple of sectors onto tempfs. You make the sectors executable. You run the sectors. Then you have your secondary bootstrap. You run those sectors. Those sectors extract a much larger executable from the underlying disk, puts it into tempfs, runs that executable. That executable extracts 3 things. A new kernel, a new init ramfs, which contains the Steganographic kernel module, and some kernel line parameters for the replacement system. It does a kexec, it loads those things, and does a reboot, and then voila, you're in a new system entirely, because the init ramfs has the Steganographic kernel module. At this point now, it can load everything, it can mount the file systems, and you have, sorry, I should have put this in, another copy of this. You have this system here. So the first part of the early user space, it sets up this crypto mapping, sets up the steg mapping, it mounts a file system, and then you have your hidden OS. And that's how this, that's how the system gets going. From a single entry point that's 1 kilobyte into this entire running system. That's basically the process. Okay, so I'll describe that in some detail now, how that process works. But I'll just back up a little bit, just to get a little bit more clarity on how you go about installing this. And it sort of gives us a bit of an understanding of all the things that are in the air, all the balls at the same time. So first thing you do when you install the hidden system, which is what you do before you install the cover system, is you establish your cryptographic mapping using, for example, crypt setup, using the hidden key. And so once you have that in place, you initialize the entire disk with coding blocks that are initialized to 0, or take your pick, because it's going to be overwritten later on by the hidden cover, the hidden OS anyway. Once you've done that, still with this cryptographic mapping in place, you overwrite a certain number of sectors with a secondary bootstrap. And you don't worry about what you overwrite because there's the heavy-duty error correction at play on the red. Then on top of that, you overwrite everything to the right with primary bootstrap. And again, everything to the right of the blue here has error correction of some kind, so you don't have to worry about what you're overwriting. When you've done all that, you take down the cryptographic mapping. And you look at the disk, and what do you see? Just random noise. It's ciphertext of something else, or it's just random noise according to your cover story, which is what you've initialized your disk to. At that point, you install your cover system using the cover key. Ubuntu does most of this automatically, for example, if that's what you want to use. And that's basically it. So if you don't have any of the keys, the underlying block device here, for example, dev SDA, will just look like randomness. If you have one of the keys, let's say the cover key, everything green will be intelligible to you. That corresponds to the cover system. Everything else will look like random noise. If you have both keys, then every sector will have some semantic meaning to it, right? So the blue sectors will correspond to the primary bootstrap, the green to the cover, the red to the underlying device, like the hidden system data, and so forth. And that's basically it. And so the booting process now, let's figure out, let's examine how that works. So the very first thing you need to do is you need to tell grub, pass a command line parameter to the kernel, say you want to break an early user space, break equals premount or something. Then you punt it into early user space. And then you just use crypt setup because your cover system has disk encryption. The default one for Ubuntu is going to be crypt setup dmcrypt. And the primary bootstrap is going to be located at some multiple of a power of 10, just because it's easy for the human to remember, right? And so the human sets up that crypto mapping for 2 sectors. So for example, dev mapper crypt, and copies over those 2 sectors to tempfs. Makes those 2 sectors executable, and then runs the 2 sectors. And at that point, they're done. And so there's a chance that will fail because those 2 sectors will have been overwritten by the cover system. That's fine, because then just instead of 10 million, try 20 million, try 30 million, so forth. But in practice, twice is probably the most you're ever going to have to do. And every now and then, blue moon, you might have to switch up which sectors you use, but that's easy to do. Okay, so now you have your primary bootstrap running. Okay, great. What does it do? The first thing it does is it takes down the cryptographic mapping. Dmcrypt, it reestablishes basically the same mapping, but this time, instead of just the 2 sectors, which the user had done, the entire disk. And it does that so that it can scan the entire disk, looking for shards of a secondary executable. And so when you installed the secondary bootstrap, basically you take a large executable, you chop it up into a whole bunch of little shards, you add a magic number to each shard, and then you spray the shards across the slack space. And you repeat a few times so that each shard is replicated a number of times. So you do it sort of pseudo-randomly so that there's no chance that the spatial distribution of the overwrite process corresponds with how you distributed your shards across the disk. So that you have higher guarantee that you have data integrity and you're going to be able to reconstruct an executable from the shards. So the primary bootstrap scans the disk, looks for all the shards, reassembles the shards, chucks out the magic number, and then you have your secondary bootstrap. And so then just does an execv system call, and it runs the secondary bootstrap. So what does the secondary bootstrap do? It's a much larger program. It contains fairly heavy-duty error correction. It actually emulates the kernel module in user space. But unlike the kernel module, which presents the OS only this block device here of a certain number of sectors, there's some additional reserved sectors here that are accessible from the user space utility, or the user space library, which this links to. In those sectors, you have the replacement kernel. You have various kernel parameters, the special video card, for example, and then you have your initramfs. And it contains the usual suspects, crypt setup, LVM, however you configured your system, and one more kernel module here, stag.ko. And so at that point, what it does is it has all the necessary ingredients. It does kexec load, or kexec, whatever, take your pick, some implementation details. And at that point, it reboots into the new system. And that's basically how it works. And so when the new system is booting, the first thing it does, as any system with disk encryption does, is it sets up your cryptographic mappings using crypt setup, for example. Then it does, if you remember, on top of the crypto mapping, there's a stag mapping. It does that by using an insmod, for example, stag.ko. And when you have an up and running system, what you'll end up with something is something that associates an SCF stab with, slash with dev stag, for example. And so just wrapping up, I mean, the primary bootstrap is really small, so it's not going to be overwritten, probably. The secondary bootstrap is much larger, but that's OK because it's recovered through error correction. So final points. It spanned a number, the development has spanned a number of different environments. So, you know, C, C++, assembly required a whole bunch of different programming approaches. Pardon me. There are about 30,000 lines in total. And we've done fairly extensive validation for, you know, integrity of the cover system to make sure that, you know, forensically the hidden system doesn't damage the cover system at all, doesn't touch it whatsoever. Tested on various combinations of Arch and Ubuntu, and so presumably this would work for any distro, take your pick. And we confirmed that you can run VirtualBox on top of a hidden system, and so you can actually put, you know, in VirtualBox you can put Windows. So if you want to have, if you need some Windows utility that you need to run, that's great. You just, you know, put it in VirtualBox and you're good to go. Okay, so there's a couple of issues. So if you're going to be using this in the fields, there's a couple things you need to be aware of. The first is multi-snapshot imaging and the various countermeasures you can take to that. So that's basically where your adversary gets a hold of your computer, images the slack space, and then images the slack space again at a later point. And somewhere in between you've used the hidden system and the slack space has changed, reflecting the use. Either one of those alone is not going to be terribly incriminating, but if you look at the differential, that might be an issue. So some countermeasures. You can cease using the hidden system after the first imaging. You can reinstall the entire system if you're allowed to by the cover story, if it's plausible. But there's no great way around it. So you get really good security as long as you're not imaged twice with having used the hidden system in between. Okay, this is a more significant issue. Concerns specifically solid-state drives. And so, you know, with your conventional magnetic hard drives, what you have is you have a fairly static mapping between a logical sector and the underlying region of the platter on which the sector is actually represented. With Flash, the nature of the medium demands that you have a constantly evolving mapping. And so that mapping between the logical sector and the actual physical medium is maintained by the Flash translation layer. Now, there's a number of other things the FTL does. It does a number of you know, record keeping. It does some stats for errors, low-level errors and stuff like that. And so it's conceivable that if an adversary has access to the flash drive, they can do some analysis on the firmware of the data that's used by the flash drive to figure out what's going on. There's a second issue, which is that what I've described so far would be for a system where you can put something in slack space not having overwritten by, for example, the trim command. And so the issue is that when you have like a standard Ubuntu installation, for example, I mean, it's going to have a cron job that runs and run trim every week or so, right? And it's going to set up the cryptographic mapping where it passes through discard commands. And so this is a bit of an issue. And so what we were able to find is that by default, at least Ubuntu, and I checked just before I left for London, again, it doesn't turn swap on with the discard command. So you could conceivably store something in swap, and not only conceivably, actually we tried this out. And so if you need to use, let's say for your cover story or just because you like the performance gains, if you need to use an SSD, that's fine. Put it away in swap, use a use a common Linux distribution, and you should be okay. The larger your main memory, typically, the larger the default swap size is going to be, which also means you're less likely to use swap in the first place. So it's actually a solution that works surprisingly well. That being said, from a forensic perspective, the best thing you can do is use a magnetic drive. Returning now to SSD firmware. So the analysis of SSD firmware, the metadata, and the FTL associated with the FTL might still be an issue. There's a couple things you can do. So if you have fairly deep pockets, you could overwrite, you could come up with a utility that overwrites that data with something that covers your tracks. That's one option. Another option is to, well, that's basically what you can do. The other option is that you can take advantage of the fact that usually the FTL is fairly vendor specific, and you can take advantage of the fact that to actually do anything with that data, it probably requires some reverse engineering. and probably requires fairly deep pockets in time to actually be able to come up with some solution that is able to detect something. So you can use that to your advantage if your adversary is not that sophisticated. Okay, so what are the takeaways here? Steganography software can recursively hide itself. So what I submit to you is that one of the problems with steganography right now is that you have, there's the expression that it's not the crime that does you in, but it's, covering up your tracks, right? And so that applies to steganography as well. You have really good options now where you can secrete things away securely, but if in the field you need to access that data and you're in a hostile environment, your options are fairly limited. And if you carry things around with you, or if you download things through insecure connections, you're going to give away what you're doing. So at this point here, we have a system that allows you to use steganography in the field with having a system that has absolutely no strange properties whatsoever, a default Linux system. So then there's a second here, which I dubbed a Russian doll steganography, which is, let's say you need to use an existing steg tool. For instance, you need to use an 802.11 wireless steg tool. And it's incriminating, and you don't want to just carry around that tool in your pocket on your computer. You can secrete it away now in this hidden system. And the third one here, it doesn't really follow from what I discussed. It's more of an FYI, which is that open channel SSDs going forward will remove a lot of like the firmware layers between the kernel and the underlying hardware. And so having more direct access to that underlying hardware is going to be really useful going forward. I think it's going to open up a lot of avenues for new forms of steganography. So the overall conclusion then. So insight in steganography use may go darker. And so what does that mean? So if you're a journalist, an NGO, or you're tasked with organizational security, like you're an ISO, law enforcement intelligence, it might affect you in a different way. So it might give you new tools to make your operations more secure, more robust against the physical security threat. On the other hand, if you're an ISO and you need to make sure that people are not exfiltrating sensitive information from your organization, that might be an issue as well. So that is basically it. So I just wanted to show you quickly, this presentation is actually running on a hidden system. So this here, I'll just show you briefly. Thank you. Okay, what do we have? So there's obviously, the cover system has a GPT table. So you do an LSBLK, you see SDA, SDA1, and SDA2, SDA1 is for grub. Yes, grub. Okay, now you have a reinterpretation of SDA with respect to this cryptographic mapping here by crypt. And it doesn't really show you here, but stag here is derived from crypt. And stag here is just another block device. I partitioned it into a 16 gigabyte swap partition, and like the balance here is 90 gigabytes because it's a fairly small SSD is my root directory for everything else. So what can you do? Let's see. Let's say we want to run Tor, because we don't necessarily want to have Tor on our computer. So there you have Tor. I'm not going to bore you with my browsing habits. Okay, so you might want to have some insight, for example, how much of the system is damaged. So if you overwrite everything on a disk with the cover system, obviously the hidden system is going to be damaged beyond repair. But the nice thing about error correction, about information theory, is that if you have a good error correction code, you have something like the cliff effect, which is up to a certain point of errors, you get, or up to a certain amount of like channel noise, you get like perfect recovery of your original data. And so you might want to know how close you are to that cliff, like where if you keep using the cover system, if you keep downloading movies or whatever terabytes, you're going to run into difficulties. So I wrote a utility for that. So this here is a system health utility. So what it shows you is the first, this here says everything is okay. Don't worry about it, you can close the window now. This here is a hidden system data. So as I said, as you use the cover system more and more, you overwrite more and more of the slack space. At some point, this needle here will go into the red. And that says, okay, buddy, be careful, because if you keep using the cover system at this rate, you're going to irretrievably damage your hidden system data. But up to that point, you're fine. Then there's your entry points here. So as I said, to get into the system, you copy over 2 sectors. You make it like some power of 10 or whatever. So you have like 10 million, 20 million, 30 million here. So these are the ones that are still surviving. It does an analysis of the disk and says, okay, you can use any one of these. So every now and then you should open up the utility and just memorize a few of these offsets here so they can boot into the system. And then you have your bootloader. Oh, so this is cut off. The screen here is a bit different from my laptop. That's basically it. So you have a utility that lets you gain insight into the health of the system. So you're never going to be caught by surprise that use of your cover system has somehow irrevocably damaged your data on the hidden system. And so with that, that's my presentation. I'd be happy to take any questions from you. And by all means, over the next day or so, feel free to find me, and I'd be happy to talk about any of this, especially the slides I skipped over, which unfortunately I didn't have time for. You can also email me at a later point, and I'd be happy to pick up some correspondence with you. So with that, I'll take questions from the audience. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Hello, interesting presentation. My question is, Encrypt is integrated in standard Linux distributions. Do you think for your technologies this could work too?
Oh, that's a very good question. So the question is, could you modify, for example, crypt setup so some of this early user space stuff is automated? If I understand correctly? Yes, okay. So the question is, what I described in one of the slides is how you get into the system in the first place, which is it's a little bit of a hack. It's not very, it adds like 30 seconds to the boot process, but it's a bit of an inconvenience. And so the question is that breaking into early user space, copying over the sectors, running them, can that be put into crypt setup? And the answer is absolutely yes, if there's a will to do that. Arguably, that would be a very good direction for Linux to go, in that you'd put plausible deniability into everybody's machine. That's, of course, ideal. So if there is a buy-in for that, that would be absolutely fabulous. There's one in the back there.
For long-term viability of the system, do there exist any tools that one could use on the cover system that would allow you to reclaim deleted space if you're worried about using up all of the entropy in your hidden system?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. In principle, one should be able to, for example, deleted files, do something with them so you can reclaim the space. From a strictly forensic perspective, I find that a little bit problematic in that if you're using custom tool to do that, that might look a bit fishy. Like the goal from the outset in designing the system is removing the necessity to do anything strange on the cover system whatsoever. And so in principle, yes, you could actually recover disk space, but the question is, does that somehow undermine your cover story?
Hi, thank you for the presentation. How easy is to configure for non-techies, for journalists or for NGO people?
It's a good question. For the moment, the configuration of a system is fairly technically involved. And like even when I put together a new system, I have a checklist, like pilots have, because it's a bit of a mess. What I'll say is this, though. Once the system is installed, it's very easy to use. So it's very user-friendly. The installation is a bit difficult to do. If you have standard hardware, you can do what's fairly customary in IT, which is have maybe an image or something like that. I'd have to give it a bit more thought to make sure that there's no forensic implications there. But the gist of it is if you have standard hardware, you should be able to automate the process. But a lot of it has to do with the fact that the hardware might be a bit different. Well, I think that's about it. Thank you very much for the talk, and I'd be happy to talk to you guys more.